Think of somebody popular, somebody well known. I would almost guarantee that none of you think of a science teacher, that none of you think of a physics professor. And yet, between the 1960s and the 1980s here in Australia, there was a visiting professor of physics who became very well known and very popular in this country. Indeed, he was so popular that his physics lectures at university were televised and the highest of honours was given to him. He got to advertise Cadbury's chocolate on TV. Who was he? Well, he was Professor Julius Sumner Miller. And his identifying trademark was the question that he used in his university lectures, this question here: why is it so? His philosophy was that education is not simply about giving students answers. His philosophy was that education is about teaching students how to think and thus to pursue the answers. And so in his lectures, he would carry out physics experiments, bring them to a conclusion, and then asked his students, why is it so? What's the explanation? And that question doesn't simply apply to physics, it applies to a whole range of subjects, and that includes human behaviour. And indeed, it is a question which is often raised by atheists in regard to the existence of God. If there is an all-loving, all-wise, all-powerful God, then why is the world the way it is? Why is it so? I have, over the years, read accounts of people who were believers in God and who were sent to war and lost their faith in God. Why? Because they couldn't understand why God would allow the horrors of war to occur. And I don't want to devote myself today to the subject of war, but I do want to consider why, in view of the way things are in the world, God allows it to be so. Why is it so that this world is the way it is? 13 days ago, on January the 28th of this year, the Doomsday Clock was reset. The Doomsday Clock was established way back in 1947 following the invention and the use of the atomic bomb. And with the onset of the Cold War, which could so easily have led to nuclear war, the Doomsday Clock was intended to warn nations of how close the world was to disaster. The clock, which is situated in Chicago, I believe, is designed to show at any given time how close the world is to midnight. And midnight symbolizes worldwide destruction. Less than 2 weeks ago, the clock was reset from 90 seconds to midnight to 89 seconds to midnight, which doesn't sound much, but is significant. It's saying that it's as though the world is less than 1.5 minutes from destruction. Why was it reset? It was done so because of the increased risk of nuclear war as a result of Russia's attack on the Ukraine, climate change, the misuse of advances in biological science, and also the misuse of advances in other technologies such as artificial intelligence. Now, some of those things I don't know very much about, but I think any one of us that watches the news or listens to the news will say that there are things in this world that do cause us concern. For instance, there is the question of China's intentions in the world, the question of Russia's intentions, North Korea's intentions. And there is also what seems to me to be an increasing American nationalism, which is featuring a decreasing awareness and understanding of the rest of the world, an almost narrow-minded view of the world. We have the situation that has been going on in the Middle East, a situation which has escalated over the last year, a situation which never seems to get resolved. The nation of Israel was established back just after the Second World War, where land was handed to Israel in the Middle East. The Arab world resented it then and has continued to resent it. And so the Arab world has fought against Israel at various times. Israel fights back and wins each time. At the same time, Israel goes on expanding its territory. And so it goes on, an ongoing circle of hate. The more Israel defends itself, the more it is hated. And the latest figures, for instance, indicate that the Gaza death toll currently stands somewhere between 45,000 and 47,000 people. Here in Australia, we are seeing a flow-on of that. We're seeing an escalation in anti-Jewish feelings. Apart from that, of course, there is inflation. If you go to the shops to get the groceries, you see the prices steadily rising. If any of you are after a house or a rental, you see the prices dramatically increasing. Australia has committed itself to the purchase of nuclear-powered submarines. I did hear a figure yesterday. I want to say it's somewhere in excess of $300 billion. This goes along with the increase of military spending around the world. The last available figures that we have were for 2023. In that year, military spending worldwide reached $2,443 billion. That's in excess of $2.4 trillion worldwide. And 2023 marked the highest figure so far recorded. And that figure had been increasing year by year for 9 years. Now, at the moment, there's problems in the Congo with people being killed there. And we might say that a lot of this has no direct impact upon us personally. But I talked last year, I think it was, about things like domestic violence, broken homes, homelessness, juvenile crime, and what seems to be the increasing extent of internet fraud and the increasing sophistication of that fraud. Now, for many of us, we are perhaps able to say, well, look, things are going okay. For me, life is pretty good. But for a lot of people in this world, it is not so good, and that may well include people that we know. So we return to the question that I raised earlier. If there is an all-loving, all-wise, all-powerful God, why does he allow humans, make humans, live in a world where there is so much suffering, so much death, so much fear, so much uncertainty? Why is it so? And this is a question that I have talked about at various times and written about down through the years. But we often take the approach, why does God allow it to be so? Why does God cause it to be so? But how about looking at it from another point of view? Why do people allow it to be so? Why do people make it to be so? Humanity has to take responsibility for its own actions. And I'm not going to list every particular cause, but I want to talk about some aspects of human behaviour that do cause problems in this world. And remember, all the individual problems together cause us big problems around the world. One thing we can talk about is hatred and racism. And there's nothing new about that. Over in John chapter 4 and verse 9, you've got Jesus talking to the Samaritan woman, and she is surprised that he, a Jew, is speaking to her. And John explains in parentheses, for Jews do not associate with Samaritans. So there was a racial prejudice even back then. In fact, you go back to Luke the 9th chapter, verses 53 and 54, and there you've got it happening the other way around, that there were Samaritans who refused to accept Jesus and his disciples because they were Jews heading down to Jerusalem. And indeed, I think it was James and John wanted to call down fire from heaven upon the Samaritans. Or you can go to Acts chapter 10 and verse 28, where Peter is sent by God to Cornelius and other Gentiles. And Peter makes the point that it was not acceptable in Jewish society to associate with Gentiles. And indeed, you go over to the next chapter, Acts chapter 11 and verses 2 and 3, and Peter gets back to Jerusalem and is immediately under fire for spending time with Gentiles. So there has been racial prejudice and hatred for a long, long time. It's happening now. It's happening in the Middle East. I remember when things first started happening there in Gaza, or whatever it was, a year or so ago, and because I worked teaching English for a while each week, I had a lot of Arabic people there talking about it, blaming Israel. And I had to say, well, hang on. It did start with an attack on Israel, but it goes back, of course, for many decades, this whole process, and there's still that prejudice there very strongly now. I saw it happening about 14 years ago when emails were being circulated in Sydney churches amongst Christians here in Sydney, which were very anti-Muslim. So even we ourselves are not completely innocent in this regard. There's hatred and racism. There's anger, uncontrolled anger, anger which really bursts forth in rage. That again is not new. You can go back to Genesis, the 4th chapter, and you've got Cain and Abel there, and they both make offerings to God. But God is pleased with Abel and his offering, but not with Cain and his offering. And in Genesis chapter 4 and verse 5, we read there that Cain became very angry. And in verse 8, that led to Cain murdering his brother. And so it is today, even in our society, where we've got deep-seated anger, and that expresses itself in domestic violence, the killing of women, road rage, divorced couples waging war against one another. Lavinia and I have had dealings with 2 cases of this in the last few years, and where you've got deeply hostile husbands manipulating their children and so forth in order to get back at their wives. So uncontrolled anger is very real within our society. There's also nationalism and politics, and that's not something we talk about so much. Nationalism is defined by the Macquarie Dictionary as, and I quote, devotion to the interests of one's own nation. So here in Australia, it would be that what we're concerned with first and foremost is Australia. Well, we've seen this put to very effective use in the recent elections in America, where there's been a very strong appeal to American nationalism and patriotism. I have a book at home called Post-God Nation. It's based on the idea that we now live in a post-Christian society. The writer is named Roy Williams. And one of the things that he argues is that the nationalism in churches and the support of churches for various wars appears to be one of the factors which has led to many Australians walking away from churches. For instance, speaking of World War I, Williams says this: a broader effect of the war was that all institutions lost credibility, but none more so than the churches. They had acted not as courageous advisors to the state, that is about whether or not to go to war, but as cheerleaders and apologists. In other words, churches were cheering, as it were, the nation on in going to war. Indeed, the Bishop of London during the First World War called that war a great crusade to kill Germans. He said, that's what it's about. We've got to kill Germans. He said it was a holy war, and he called on the Church of England to mobilise the nation for war. So there was a case of the church urging the nation on. And Williams says the same sort of thing was going on here in Australia, where churches were urging men to go to war, and churches were arguing for the war. A few years ago, I was listening on the radio to an interview between Philip Adams and Tim Costello, who's the brother of the former federal treasurer, Peter Costello. And Tim Costello said that at that time, a recent visit to the US, one of the things that had bothered him was the prevalence of the US flag flying over church buildings. And it was almost as though that was the primary thing, that the country was what it was all about. Even in Churches of Christ in the US, I've seen very strong support and advocacy in regard to various political parties and political candidates. Back in 1981 and 82, when Lavinia and I were in the US for a while, I remember reading a letter to the editor of one of the major Brotherhood journals. I think it was the Christian Chronicle, but I'm not sure. And the writer asked the editor if, in view of the strong political views in the church in the US, could a person be considered a Christian if they voted Democrat rather than Republican? It'd be like saying here, are you a Christian if you vote Labor rather than Liberal or something, or turn it around if you want to. And that feeling is still there, talking to Americans over the last year or so. It's almost as though your Christian duty is to vote for a particular political party, and you're not a true Christian if you vote for another party. Indeed, even here in Australia, I got called out by a Christian lady because I happened to mention that one party supported same-sex marriage. And she made a big issue about me mentioning that. Now, coming back to nationalism, one of the big problems with nationalism is that when we start getting overly supportive for our own nation, what do we start doing? We look down upon those from other nations. And as Christians, the danger is, of course, that we place nationalism at a higher level than we do Christ and Christianity. If you go over to Galatians chapter 3 and verse 28, the message there is that nationality should not be an issue in regard to Christians. Galatians 3:28, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And that is the case here, where we've got a range of nationalities. Doesn't matter. We are one in Christ Jesus. So we've got to watch that we don't let nationalism and politics become a dividing factor, which it is in various parts of the world. I want to add something else too, and it's something I've mentioned a number of times in recent years, and that is delusional thinking. You know, when it comes to the various stages of European history at least, we often speak of the Dark Ages, the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, the Industrial Age, and so on. Well, it's been my view for some years now that we presently live in an age of delusion. We live in an age that is opposed to reason. And you can see this demonstrated in various ways. There's a rejection or a mistrust of science. There has been the development of what was called the New Age movement. Particularly, this sense of delusion was evident during the COVID epidemic. And also, I have to say, in the recent US elections. There has been the idea, for instance, that any news which doesn't agree with my view of things is fake news. I reject everything as false that doesn't agree with me. There is a wide spreading and acceptance of what are called conspiracy theories, even though in many cases there's no logical evidence to support these so-called conspiracies. And indeed, there are people who hold to conspiracies even when the evidence proves those conspiracies to be wrong. There's a rejection of medical procedures which have been of great help in the world for some generations now. We've seen the rise of anti-vaxxers trying to turn people away from vaccinations. And what is that doing? It's putting children and it's putting society at risk. And there are people who say, well, I know somebody who had a vaccination and they had a very bad reaction. I personally know somebody who had a bad reaction. They were a child and they died because of the vaccination. You say, well, that proves it. Well, people react to all sorts of things. My father nearly died under a certain anaesthetic years ago and found he was allergic to a commonly used anaesthetic. I used to take Voltaren tablets because of my back. And then all of a sudden my face, my mouth all started swelling up. I had an anaphylactic reaction. I can't take those tablets. And you may have something you're allergic to as well. But that doesn't mean that we wipe out all that medicine. And yet that is what some people are calling for in the world. The trouble with delusional thinking is that there is a denial that there is any such thing as objective truth. Truth is whatever I want it to be. So if I don't want to believe in the election results as occurred 4 years ago, then as far as I'm concerned, I have the right to fight against the bureaucracy and to say that we're being taken over just simply on the basis of my personal views. And if we're rejecting objective truth, we also reject Christianity and we reject the Bible. We reject any idea of a social morality, and we have the rejection too of any sense of right and wrong, any objective sense. And so our view is that, look, truth is whatever I decide for me. And thus we go way back to the time of the judges, where we're told everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That's in Judges 21:25 and some other references as well. Truth becomes whatever we want it to be, and if anybody doesn't agree with my definition of truth, then that's too bad. I'm right, you're wrong. And we could go on and we could talk about various other things, but there's a word that sums it all up, and that is the word sin. Sin causes an awful lot of problems, terrible problems in this world. And for instance, Tolu read a passage about that in Romans chapter 1. And this talks about the Gentiles and how, though they had known God way back, they turned away from God and they turned to idolatry. They started worshipping the creation rather than the Creator. And that led to a whole lot of problems. Romans 1, beginning 24, therefore God gave them up to vile impurity in the lusts of their hearts, so that their bodies would be dishonoured among them. For they exchanged the truth of God for falsehood, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason God gave them over to degrading passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for that which is contrary to nature, and likewise the men too abandoned natural relations with women and burned in their desire towards one another, males with males, committing shameful acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a depraved mind to do those things that are not proper. People having been filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, and evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unfeeling, and unmerciful. And although they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they do not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. And notice 3 times here, verse 24, God gave them up. Verse 26, God gave them over. Verse 28, God gave them up to a depraved mind. They were so persistent in their sin that in the end God let them go. But you say, yes, but then there were the Jewish people. They had God's guidance, and they did. And you can imagine a Jew reading chapter 1 about the Gentiles and saying, see what bad people they are. But Paul has this to say in chapter 2, beginning in verse 17, to the Jews. But if you call yourself a Jew and rely upon the law and boast in God and know his will and distinguish the things that matter, being instructed from the law, and are confident that you yourself are a guide to people who are blind, a light to those in darkness, a corrector of the foolish, a teacher of the immature, possessing in the law the embodiment of knowledge and of the truth, you therefore who teach someone else, do you not teach yourself? You who preach that one is not to steal, do you steal? You who say that one is not to commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who loathe idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, through your breaking of the law, do you dishonor God? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you, just as it is written. The message here, there's a problem with sin among Gentiles and among Jews. In other words, among all. And as it goes on to say in Romans, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So there is a world of problems. And atheists will often ask, if there is a loving, all-wise, all-powerful God, why doesn't he do something about all the evil that is in the world? Well, the thing is that God has been doing something and God is doing something, but the problem is that we humans reject what God has been doing. And you can see this again in Romans chapters 1 and 2. God has provided his saving gospel, backing it up with the historical resurrection of Jesus Christ, but many in the world choose to reject that. And you see that in Romans chapter 1, verses 1 to 4 and verses 16 and 17. In Romans chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, God has demonstrated his existence in his creation, but many choose to reject that. Romans chapter 1, verses 21 to 23, God early in history allowed himself to be known by humanity, but many rejected that and turned to idolatry. And in Romans chapter 2, verses 12 to 29, God gave his law initially to the Israelites, but many of them chose to reject that, despite prophet after prophet after prophet who was sent by God to turn the people back. And I've gone through those quickly, and I may come back to those, God willing, in a later lesson. But the point is, God is doing something. Humans are rejecting his efforts. We can't blame the world upon God. We've got to accept our own responsibility in what goes on. You might say, well, how can I affect the whole world? What you and I do is what others do, and collectively we affect the whole world. I listened once to news reports about a court case, and from the details that were presented, the accused blamed everything else and everyone else for their actions. They not once blamed their own self. And so it is with those who blame God for all the evil in the world. No responsibility is accepted for the extensive evil that humans can do. There is much in this world that is good, but there is also much in this world that is bad. And why is it so? Because of the choices that we humans make and because of what we humans do. So, in dealing with the question of evil, where should we begin? We should begin with our own selves, because that's where the problem started. And that's where the problem continues to exist. There was a religious tract, a booklet many years ago in the church, and it was titled, "A Better World Begins With Me." And that's true today. A better world does begin, first of all, with me. If I do what I can and you do what you can, and many others take up that, then we do start making things better. But we still wrestle with sin, and we need God's help. But the way to receive God's help is for us, first of all, to admit that we have a problem and we need to do something about it. So rather than blaming God, we need to turn to God, and we need to believe in God and repent of our wrongs and be baptized into Jesus Christ, and thereafter strive to walk in the light, as it says in the book of 1 John. So let's not blame God. Let's admit our own responsibilities and do what we can to put those behind us and be fully committed to Him. Let's stand and sing.